All right, everyone, we are getting into Unit 6, which is about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And so within this unit, there's kind of just three main parts to it. First of all, we're going to introduce aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And as you can kind of tell from the title, it is going to build off of our stuff from Unit 2 with just regular old supply and demand. But then we're going to get into talking about fiscal and monetary policy in the next two sections, which is more or less just whenever our economy is not performing the way it's supposed to, how does the government or the Federal Reserve get involved to do something about that? So we have to go back to our main idea about what macroeconomics is. And we, a long time ago, used this definition, kind of textbook, whatever definition of saying it's a field of economics that studies the behavior of the aggregate economy. Now, aggregate is that key word we want to focus on because aggregate means total. So we need to remember that anytime we hear that word aggregate, we're really just meaning total. So if we want to be able to study the aggregate economy or the total economy, we have to look at the entire thing. And so in micro, when we use supply and demand, we just were trying to understand the market for like a single good or service. So maybe for a pair of shoes, what is the supply of those shoes? What is the demand for those shoes at any price level or any price for that pair of shoes? However, in macroeconomics, since we're trying to study the total supply, the aggregate supply, or the total demand, the aggregate demand, we want to understand the aggregate or the total economy. And so in order to understand that total economy, we have to use this aggregate supply and aggregate demand. But like I said, you're going to see some of those same key ideas apply from the micro supply and demand as you will with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So first of all, what we need to do is remember, what does our graph look like? And in micro, we had labeled our axes a little bit different. We had right here, we had price, and here we had quantity. Now we're going to keep it similar. Mainly when we look at the y-axis and we talk about price in micro, we can't do the same thing for macro. If we're looking at the entire economy instead of just one product, we have to understand this as a price level, which is the average level of prices within an economy, because we can't just put price there. We have goods that range anywhere from a couple pennies up to millions of dollars. And so that wouldn't make sense. And so since we're trying to study the entire economy, we use price level because that allows us to look at an average level of prices across the economy. If you remember, we had talked about the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That's a price index that we often use to measure our price level because it's one that we pretty well understand to be the goods and services that people like you and I, or goods and services that people like you and I tend to get. Now, the real GDP is what we use instead of quantity. And then this should make sense as well, because we can't just say the number of goods and services our country produces, our output in a year, because we could make some goods that are worth a couple pennies or worth millions of dollars. And obviously, if we're making products that are worth millions of dollars, we're being a little bit more productive. And so the real GDP measures the total market value of all these goods and services that we produce within that given year. So that's how our graph is going to look a little bit different, but this is the graph we're going to be using throughout our aggregate supply and aggregate demand unit. So first of all, we need to understand what our aggregate demand is. In a nutshell, our aggregate demand shows us that total quantity, or the aggregate total. It shows us the total quantity of goods and services that households, firms, government, and customers abroad want to buy at each price level. And so in the same way we saw with micro, a downward sloping demand curve, what this is representing is that real GDP at every price level. So we look over here, and in the same way that micro, we said the quantity at every price, this is just saying the real GDP, the total demand at each price level. And we see our law of demand actually in action as we look at this, because as price levels are high, we see that the total amount of goods and services that people demand is fairly low. Because if prices are high, your money doesn't go as far. It doesn't allow you to buy as much stuff. Now, whenever prices are low, like if the price level is way down here, we see that there's a much higher quantity of goods and services that are being demanded because your money now goes further. If you had $100, that $100 is going to buy you more stuff whenever the price level is really low versus whenever that price level is really high. So in our case, we're going to start using Y just as the variable instead of our GDP for real GDP. It'll make things a little bit easier for us. But an important reason we're using this is because we're going to look back at our GDP formula. If you remember, it's Y, or real GDP, equals C plus I plus G plus X subscript N, which just stands for net exports. The C standing for consumer spending, I for investment spending, G for government spending, and then net exports. Now, we had talked about before this representing our real GDP because anything that we produce within our country in a given year is either going to be bought by consumers, businesses, government, or bought by customers abroad. And so that would add up to our real GDP. But one thing we also need to understand is since our aggregate demand represents the total demand for goods and services, and right here our Y is equal to the demand by consumers, businesses, governments, or customers abroad, we understand our aggregate demand curve to represent that real GDP. So let's say we're hanging out here at this price level 1, output Y1, and what we see here is that according to the law of demand, as that price level changes, like let's say that price level goes down, as that price level changes, so does our output. So as the price falls, we see that according to the law of demand, the total demand for goods and services is going to increase. Again, as prices go down, your $100 buys you more stuff. And so the total demand across the economy is going to increase. Now, again, we see this as a change in price level. And think back to micro, we said the only thing that causes a shift along our curve was a change in price. In the same way, this movement along our curve is being caused by a change in price level. So when we see this movement along the curve, why do we see it? There's kind of 3 explanations that we see as to why we have movement along the curve and really explaining this downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. The first one is the wealth effect. This is just the idea that whenever the price level changes, you aren't richer, but you definitely feel richer, like if the price was to go down. So if price levels were to drop, my $100 that I have can now buy me more stuff. I'm not richer, but because what we'd say like my purchasing power increases, I feel richer. And so therefore I demand or I buy more stuff. Same is true for everyone else across the economy, and that's why we see the aggregate demand or that amount as the price level goes down, we see that total output demanded increase. We also have one that's known as the interest rate effect. This is just saying is while some people might go out and spend that extra money, let's say price level drops, and whenever the price level drops, we notice that people go and buy the same stuff they did before, but now they have extra money, and what they choose to do with that extra money instead of spending it is they save it. Well, whenever they save it, what it does is it puts more money into banks. As it puts more money into banks, we see that it increases capacity to loan. As that happens, we see that interest rates fall, and as interest rates fall, investment goes up, which is part of our GDP formula. So there we just saw, hey, as that price level goes down and people put more money into banks, it allows for an increase in investment. Hey, that's part of our GDP formula. It causes GDP to rise. And finally, we have the exchange rate effect. What we know the exchange rate effect to mean is that let's say our price levels fall within the United States. As price levels fall within the United States, our goods and services now look relatively cheaper to foreign countries. And so what we notice is that foreign countries now want to buy more stuff from the United States. And because they want to buy more stuff from the United States, that's going to influence or actually increase our net exports. At the same time, we'll also see that not only will our exports increase, but our imports will actually decrease because more people domestically will buy domestically. And so again, that causes an increase in our net exports. As it causes an increase in our net exports, that's part of this Y, and we see that as the price level drops, we would see an increase. So that kind of explains why we have this downward sloping curve. But remember, a change in the price level is causing that movement along the curve, right? Change in price level along the curve. So that's movement along the curve, but what are determinants that would cause a shift of the entire aggregate demand curve? We call these non-price level changes. Just like we saw with micro, we saw that there are these non-price determinants that caused a shift of the entire curve. So again, let's say we're hanging out at this price level. What would cause us to now at this price level demand a higher output than just Y1? And what we would see is a shift of our entire curve because now at PL1, our price level 1, we have a higher total demand for goods and services. And so what in the world would cause that? But first of all, we have to go back and look at our GDP formula. If Y is equal to CIG plus X subscript N, if we're wanting our Y to increase, like right here we see Y1 increases to Y2, price level staying the same. So what would cause an increase in Y? Again, looking right here, what would cause an increase in Y? Well, it would have to be an increase in either the C, the I, the G, or the X sub N. And so those are the 4 determinants that we see a change in consumer spending. If there's an increase in consumer spending, prices have not changed, but there's an increase in consumer spending, it would cause a shift of our entire curve. Same thing with investment spending. Increase in investment spending at price levels staying the same, we'd see an increase in our GDP. Same thing with government spending, same thing with net exports. And this is true for either an increase or a decrease. So that brings us to supply. Now, one thing we have to be very aware of when it comes to the aggregate, we're actually going to be talking about two different supply curves. So not only are we going to just be talking about a single upward sloping supply curve, we're actually going to be talking about another supply curve as well. The way we differentiate between these is we say that one of these supply curves is what we call short run aggregate supply. The other is going to be something that we refer to as long run aggregate supply. But first of all, we need to understand what the difference is here. Remember, we said that short run is whenever we have inputs that are fixed. That's going to play an important role. Anytime that we have inputs that are fixed. In the long run, everything becomes unfixed, everything is variable, we can make changes pretty freely. So short-run aggregate supply shows not the total amount of goods and services that are demanded, but it shows the total amount of goods and services in our economy that are able and willing to be produced and sold by firms at every single price level. Now again, what we see is an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve because in the short run, what we notice is that law of supply in action. Whenever the price level is high, the total amount of goods and services that is willing and able to be supplied is fairly high. However, when price levels are low, we see that the total amount of goods and services that are being supplied is fairly low. And so that's why we have this upward sloping curve. Now, again, Y being our variable for real GDP, we notice that if we're at price level 1 here, which is at our output of Y1, and we see a change in our price level, according to that law of supply, as the price level changes, Y is too. And according to our law of supply, as the price level rises, so will our real output, our real GDP. That Y increases from Y1 to Y2 as our price level increases from PL1 to PL2. So what causes this movement along? Again, a change in price level is causing that movement along the curve. How do we explain this when it comes to the short run aggregate supply curve? Well, we kind of see three different explanations for this. The first one is something that we call the sticky wage theory. And whenever we say like sticky wage, what we're referring to is just the fact that, hey, in the short run, wages are sticky, they're stuck. What we mean by that is like people and in businesses enter into contracts. And whenever they enter into those contracts, really what they're doing is they are saying, hey, for the next, say, I don't know, 3 years, for the next 3 years, we're going to enter into an agreement that will pay you $20 an hour. Now, as price levels change, maybe across that 3 years of the contract, that's going to impact the ability for the producer to maybe hire more workers. So let's say that price levels rise during that time, but I'm still paying my workers $20 an hour. Well, because price levels rose, I'm actually able to increase my profits per product, which I can reinvest and then therefore make more. We also notice though in the short run that prices tend to be sticky. This is sometimes referred to as the menu cost theory. And what we say with the menu cost theory is just, again, in the short run, prices are sticky, and because prices are sticky, they can't react fast enough in the same way that wages can't react fast enough. And then finally, we have the misperceptions theory, which is just this theory that's saying is that sometimes short run supply increases as price levels increase because, again, of a misperception, meaning that maybe within a certain market, producers think that price change is directly related to the change in demand for their product, when really it's related to a change in price level. They just don't realize it because they're kind of focused in on their own area. So in the short run, what they do is they actually increase their supply because they think they're responding to an increase in demand, when really that change in price isn't caused by an increase in demand, it's caused by an increase in price level. So again, what we're seeing here is movement along the curve. Keep that in mind, movement along the curve. Then finally, we have a shift of the entire short run aggregate supply curve. A shift of this entire curve, remember, is not caused by a change in the price level. It's instead caused by a non-price level determinant. We're only going to talk about two of these for the short run aggregate supply, but let's say we're at this price level right here, PL1, and we have an output of Y1. Well, what is something that would cause our production at that price level to increase from Y1 to Y2? What would allow our economy to start producing a greater quantity of goods and services at that price level? The two things that we're going to say just is a change in the quantity of resources and a change in technology. Both of those things are two things we've been able to observe over time, is that as we have more resources available to us, obviously we can produce more. Change in technology allows us to be more efficient and more productive. And so therefore those cause a shift of the entire short-run aggregate supply curve. Now we're getting into the long-run aggregate supply curve here. The long-run aggregate supply curve shows us the quantity of goods and services that firms are willing and able to produce when our economy is being fully efficient with our resources. Our long-run aggregate supply curve is actually just a vertical line, and the reason that is because if we think about it in the long run, and if this is representing full efficiency, that change in price level won't affect our GDP. It's not going to affect our output. Just because prices change doesn't affect our output because we're already being fully efficient. We can't be overly efficient just because price levels changes. What we're saying is that in the long run, a change in the price level does not impact our output. So it represents a sustainable, that's another thing you'll hear me say, sustainable or potential level of production or level of output. So what are the things that cause a shift of this entire curve? We're actually going to talk about these as being the exact same ones that cause a shift of our short run. So it's going to be a change in the quantity of our resources or a change in technology. And obviously we've seen that happen over time. You know, if you think back to the production of a car back in the early 1900s versus now, well, yeah, we've been able to become more efficient and increase our sustainability or our productivity level because of changes in resources and change in technology. But this is also very similar to our production possibilities curve. Because if you remember, our production possibilities curve showed us what was possible when we were being fully efficient with all of our resources in the same way that our long-run aggregate supply curve does. So finally, what we want to talk about is what's going on with our equilibriums. We need to be very aware of what's going on with our equilibriums. We're going to have two equilibriums that we talk about. The same way that we had a short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply, we're going to have a short-run equilibrium and a long-run equilibrium. Our short-run equilibrium is just wherever our aggregate demand curve intersects with our short-run aggregate supply curve. Wherever that price level is, we'll call it PLE. PLE represents the amount of goods being demanded, but also the amount of goods that are being supplied. And whenever those intersect, we are obviously at an equilibrium, where our total output that's being demanded is equal to our total output being supplied. That represents where our economy is producing right now, because again, it's in the short run. So it's where we're producing at this given moment, and that's something important for us to understand. That shows where our economy is operating right now. Whenever we look at the long-run equilibrium, though, the long-run equilibrium is going to be wherever those two curves intersect, but also wherever they intersect is at the same point where they intersect with the long-run aggregate supply. So if you notice, all three curves are intersecting with one another. And so at a price level of PLE for price level equilibrium, we notice that the amount of goods and services being demanded is equal to the amount of goods and services being supplied. But this is also happening wherever our potential is, meaning that at that short run, where we're at right now, where we're operating, we're being fully efficient. So what we need to understand then is whenever we have these equilibriums, what does it mean? What does it mean in relation to how our economy is actually doing? So whenever we're operating at our potential, it's exactly that same graph that we just saw. Our green curve, our long-run aggregate supply curve, represents our potential. It represents our maximum sustainable output in the long run. And so with all resources being used efficiently, this is where we're operating right now. There's no unemployment that is cyclical. It's just our natural rate of unemployment. We have that frictional and structural, but no cyclical unemployment. So we're at full employment, as we call it. We're operating at our potential. This is our goal. This is where we want to be. This is when our economy is, like we said, in this long run equilibrium. We're operating at our potential. But more importantly, we're operating at a level that is sustainable for us in the long run. Now, what happens whenever we're not operating at that long-run equilibrium? Well, let's say our long-run aggregate supply is represented here by YP, so Y GDP, so which is real GDP at our potential. And we have our aggregate demand curve, but our short-run aggregate supply curve, and they're intersecting over here to the left. Here's what we need to notice is we are currently, right, the short-run equilibrium where those two curves intersect represents our short-run equilibrium. They are intersecting at YE. If you notice, YE is below our potential. Our potential is out here at YP, but YE is where we currently are. And so anywhere where those two curves intersect over here to the left of our green curve represents us being below our potential. Any intersection to the left, we're operating below our potential, meaning our resources aren't being used efficiently. Our unemployment rate would be above our natural rate, so it would be above that 4 to 5%, meaning that that cyclical unemployment does exist. But more importantly, our real GDP is actually below its potential, meaning that we're in a recession. So we're in a recession, that kind of stinks. What do we do about it? That's really what we're going to be getting into in 6.2 and 6.3. But we call this a recessionary gap. This gap right here between where we are currently operating and where we could be operating represents that we're in a recession because we are operating below our potential. We want to be at our potential, at our sustainable level. Right now we're below sustainability. Then it gets into, what about the other side of things? What would happen if we are operating at a point that's beyond our potential? And a lot of people look at this and they say, hey, that's pretty good, right? Like that's not a bad thing, but we can see it can actually be dangerous for us. Whenever we're operating above our potential, anytime those two curves are intersecting over there to the right, what we notice is our short run, where we're operating right now, YE, is at a point that is greater than YP. We notice at this point we actually have what we call inflationary pressure because price levels are higher than normal. Unemployment rate is actually below the natural rate and real GDP is above its potential. We call this an expansionary gap. This gap right here between YP, our potential, and YE, our equilibrium, this gap is an expansionary, or you might hear it sometimes called an inflationary gap. Now we look at this and we're like, well, what's wrong with that? Well, the idea here is this green line represents us being sustainable. So imagine you're going and you're running a marathon. There's a running pace, which represents this green line. It's a running pace that is sustainable for you to run that entire marathon at. Now, if we look at that below potential, like if you were to go to the start line and they say ready, go, and you start walking, well, that's below your potential. You can do better than just going out there and walking. You have a sustainable running pace you could run for all 26 miles. Now over here, when we're above our potential, we're above what's sustainable for us. So yeah, we can do it for a little bit, but it might have long-term consequences. If I get to that start line and they say go, and I take off at a dead sprint, yeah, I might be able to do that for a mile, but then the next 25 miles, I'm gonna be in a world of hurt. I might be thrown up on the side or something like that, you know? And so yeah, we can do that for a little bit, but it's not healthy for our economy to sustain there. Actually, what we see is if we let that run its course, we actually run into some issues later with inflation. And so what we're going to talk about in 6.2 and 6.3 is whenever we're outside of our potential, outside of our long run equilibrium, either above it or below it, how do we get back to our long run equilibrium and get back to our potential? We're going to talk about how the government and the Federal Reserve step in those situations.